Deep inside the restricted corridors of Windsor Castle, something surfaced that was never meant to be seen again. Not a crown jewel, not a forgotten letter, but a sealed envelope marked with a symbol only one person had the authority to use. According to reports, that seal belonged to Queen Elizabeth II, and it was reserved for matters she considered too sensitive for even her closest advisors. What was inside that envelope? Insiders claim sent palace officials into immediate crisis mode. And the reason wasn't political. It was personal. Even worse, it allegedly pointed toward the future of the monarchy itself. The story begins quietly, the way most dangerous secrets do. During what was described as routine archival work, a rarely accessed vault beneath Windsor was opened. These rooms don't hold everyday documents. They're reserved for materials tied to succession, private family matters, and constitutional stability. According to accounts from people familiar with the process, an experienced archivist noticed an envelope that hadn't appeared on any previous inventory. Heavy paper, red wax. The Queen's personal seal. That alone was enough to halt everything. Within minutes, senior officials were alerted, and soon after, the decision was made to open it. Inside, reports claim, were DNA test results dating back more than a decade. Not vague notes, not incomplete paperwork, but professionally documented genetic analyses commissioned through a private medical laboratory. The tests were reportedly conducted under anonymous reference numbers, a common method for high-profile clients seeking discretion. But accompanying documentation allegedly made it clear these samples came from within the immediate royal family. And what those results suggested, insiders say, raised questions no one inside the palace was prepared to answer. According to sources familiar with the findings, the analysis focused on genetic markers used to trace paternal lineage. Specifically, Y chromosome patterns passed from father to son over generations. These markers are often used by genealogists to confirm family lines stretching back centuries. The issue, as it's been described, wasn't subtle. The markers didn't line up the way official records said they should. Somewhere along the line, the genetic trail appeared to shift, not conclusively proving anything on its own, but enough to contradict what history books have always claimed. And that contradiction was serious enough that the Queen herself had chosen to lock it away. That raises an uncomfortable question. Why would a monarch known for caution, patience, and long-term thinking order such tests in the first place? According to people who've studied her private papers, the Queen had carried quiet concerns about genealogy for years. Nothing dramatic, nothing public. Just unanswered questions passed down through whispered conversations and half-finished sentences. Advances in genetic science around the early 2010s reportedly offered her something no previous monarch had access to: certainty, or at least the chance to find it. The decision to test if reports are accurate was handled with extreme discretion. Samples were allegedly collected during routine medical procedures, with no indication they would be used for lineage analysis. Only a handful of people are said to have known the true purpose. And when the results came back in 2013, they presented the Queen with an impossible choice. She could investigate further. She could act, or she could do what she ultimately did: seal the information away, neither destroying it nor acknowledging it. Preserving the truth without letting it detonate, that choice may have delayed a reckoning, but it didn't erase it. Because when the envelope was opened years later, the silence broke instantly. Emergency calls were made, meetings were scheduled, and by that evening, the information had reached the highest levels of the royal household, including Prince William. Those close to the situation say William's reaction was immediate disbelief, then anger, then something closer to fear, not for himself, but for what this could mean for his children, especially Prince George of Cambridge. George's entire life has been shaped around a single expectation: future king, future symbol of continuity. And suddenly, according to speculation, that future carried a question mark no one could publicly explain. It's important to be clear here. No official statement has confirmed any of this. There has been no public acknowledgement of DNA tests, no admission of inconsistencies, no declaration of crisis. Everything discussed so far exists in the realm of reports, whispers, and private briefings. But even unverified information can become dangerous when it threatens perception, because the monarchy doesn't function on biology alone. It functions on belief. Legally, most constitutional experts reportedly agree that DNA does not override legitimacy. Succession law was written centuries before genetic science existed. A child born within a recognized marriage is legally legitimate, regardless of biology. That principle has held for generations. But public opinion doesn't always follow legal logic. If doubts take hold, even unfounded ones, they can weaken institutions built on tradition and trust, according to palace walls. According to reports, the focus shifted quickly from legality to containment. Who knew how many copies existed? What digital traces remained? Access to sensitive archives was tightened. Knowledge of the discovery was reportedly limited to a tiny circle. Not because the truth was illegal, but because once something like this escapes, it can't be put back. Through all of this, one priority appears to have overridden everything else: protecting George. Those familiar with the family say there was unanimous agreement that he should remain unaware. No child should carry the weight of adult uncertainty. No 12-year-old should be forced to question his identity, his future, or his place in the world because of secrets buried decades before he was born. That determination may explain why nothing has surfaced publicly, why no leaks have been confirmed, why the story, if true, remains trapped in silence. But silence is fragile, and history has a way of resurfacing the things people try hardest to hide. What makes this story unsettling isn't the idea that royal bloodlines are imperfect. Historians have long accepted that human relationships are messy, even in palaces. What makes it unsettling is the collision between ancient institutions and modern certainty. DNA doesn't care about crowns. Science doesn't respect tradition. And when those worlds collide, the fallout isn't always immediate, but it's rarely avoidable. If the reports are wrong, this remains nothing more than a modern royal myth. Another rumor that fades into obscurity. But if even part of it is true, then one sealed envelope may have forced the monarchy to confront a reality it was never designed to face. A future where inheritance isn't just ceremonial but examinable, where legacy can be questioned, and where protecting a child may mean carrying a secret heavy enough to reshape an entire institution. For now, the envelope is sealed again. The discussions remain private, and Prince George continues his life unaware that somewhere, deep within a castle built to last 1,000 years, a document exists that may one day change everything. The part that really keeps palace insiders awake at night isn't the science, it's the timing. Because even if nothing in those papers has any legal power, the moment the public believes there's a hidden truth, the story starts running on its own. And the royal family has learned the hard way that once a narrative escapes the gates, it doesn't matter how many lawyers you have. It matters how fast the internet decides what it wants to believe. That's why, according to reports, the next phase wasn't about figuring out what the documents meant. It was about figuring out who might find out. Because the danger wasn't the envelope sitting in a secure room. The danger was the human beings who'd already seen it. A rumor doesn't need 100 witnesses. It needs one person with a conscience, a grudge, or a payday in mind. And when something touches succession, there are always people circling, waiting for a crack. What makes it even more complicated is that the monarchy's rules weren't built for a world where anyone can zoom in on a family tree, compare old photos, and run what-if scenarios in a comment section. Centuries ago, royal legitimacy was decided by parliament, by alliances, and sometimes by sheer force. Now, it can be tested in the court of public opinion in a single weekend. That's the nightmare scenario. Doesn't care about law, and definitely doesn't wait for official statements. And here's where it gets messy. Because if the palace says nothing, people will claim that's proof. But if the palace says something, they risk turning whispers into headlines. It's a trap where every option fuels speculation. Even the most careful denial can backfire, because it invites the obvious follow-up. Denied what, exactly? That's why sources claim the official strategy wasn't to fight the rumor. It was to starve it. No confirmation, no engagement, no oxygen. Just silence so thick it becomes its own security system. But silence has a weakness. It depends on control. And control is hard when even a tiny detail leaks. A date, a lab name, a single line from a report. That's all it would take. Once journalists smell a locked story, they don't stop. They pull threads. They call old staff. They watch who gets reassigned. They track which experts suddenly show up at the palace. And if there's one thing modern reporting thrives on, it's patterns. A mystery becomes irresistible the the moment it looks like someone's trying to hide it. That's why, in the days after the alleged discovery, royal watchers claimed there were unusual movements behind the scenes. A quiet tightening of access. Routine changes that didn't feel routine. Meetings that were never listed. Advisors arriving and leaving at odd hours. None of that proves anything. But to people trained to spot shifts in palace behavior, it looked like damage control. And when the palace goes into lockdown mode, the public tends to assume there's something worth locking down. This is also where the story stops being about the queen and starts being about her son. Because if these documents exist, and if the late queen chose not to destroy them, then she didn't just leave behind a secret. She left behind a decision she refused to make publicly. And now, if reports are accurate, King Charles and Prince William would be the ones forced to carry it. Insiders claim Charles reacted with a kind of quiet dread. Not dramatic panic, not shouting, more like the slow realization that the institution he waited his whole life to inherit might be standing on a fault line no one can admit exists, and there's a cruel irony to that. Charles spent decades being criticized for things he couldn't control, preparing for a job defined by tradition. Then he becomes king only to find that tradition might be the very thing about to fracture. William's position, according to speculation, is even more brutal, because this isn't just about an institution, it's about his child. When you strip away the titles and the history, William is still a father watching the ground shift beneath his son's future. That's why, as some accounts describe it, the conversations allegedly became less about what do we do and more about what do we protect. And the answer was always the same. George, here's the part most people miss. Even if the legal system doesn't care about DNA, kids do. Kids care about identity, about stability, about knowing who they are and where they belong. George has spent his entire life being gently guided toward a future role, with adults around him carefully shaping his understanding of duty. If a storm hit that narrative, whether it was true, false, or exaggerated, the psychological impact could be enormous. And according to people close to the family, that's why Catherine's stance became the emotional anchor. Whatever happens, their son doesn't become collateral. So, what options would the palace even have if this story ever broke wider? There are basically 3 paths, and all of them come with a price. The first path is the simplest on paper and the hardest in practice. Deny everything and refuse to discuss it. That's the business as usual play. The monarchy has survived scandals before by outlasting them. Let the story flare up, let it burn itself out, and keep moving. The risk is obvious. Denials can sound like confirmation to people who already want to believe something. And the more the palace insists, the more some audiences dig in. The second path is controlled acknowledgement without details. Something vague, something legalistic. The kind of statement that says, we do not comment on private medical matters where succession is governed by law, not speculation. This path tries to calm the constitutional anxiety without feeding the rumor. But it has a problem. Vague statements are magnets for interpretation. People read into every word. What they don't say becomes the story. The third path is the nuclear option. Parliament stepping in to strengthen the legal definition of succession, making it crystal clear that legitimacy is based on established recognition, not genetic testing. If this ever happened, it could stabilize the monarchy legally, but it could also raise the loudest question of all. Why was that clarification suddenly necessary? And that's why, according to reports, palace advisors allegedly leaned toward the one thing that monarchies always choose when faced with a story that can't be controlled: time, delay, quiet containment. Make sure the next news cycle arrives before this one has proof. Let the public's attention drift, because attention is the fuel that turns rumor into reality. But time doesn't erase curiosity. It builds it, because once people believe there's a secret, they start hunting for clues in places the palace can't lock. Old biography, historical gossip, facial comparisons, family resemblance debates. If you've ever seen how fast the internet can turn a coincidence into a pattern, you know exactly how this would go. A single photo becomes evidence. A caption becomes a sign. Even silence becomes a confession. None of it needs to be true to go viral. It just needs to feel true. And that's where the story shifts again, because it's not only about whether a bloodline was broken, it's about how fragile the entire idea of Hereditary power becomes once people start seeing it as something testable. For centuries, monarchy survived because it lived in symbolism. It felt permanent, untouchable, above the noise. But DNA isn't symbolic. It's clinical. It's numbers. It turns myth into a lab report. And that's exactly why it terrifies institutions built on tradition. Still, even if the rumor exploded tomorrow, it wouldn't automatically change the line of succession. That's the part that gets lost in the drama. The UK system isn't a genetic contest. It's a legal and parliamentary framework. It's built to prioritize stability over biology. And that's likely why, if this story has any truth to it at all, it was sealed instead of acted on. Because once you start correcting the past, you don't just rewrite a family tree. You invite a constitutional earthquake. But here's what makes this story so sticky. Even if nothing changes legally, people might still change emotionally. And once public confidence cracks, it's hard to repair, because the monarchy's real power has always been trust. The second the public starts asking, if this can be questioned, what else can be questioned? The institution enters a new era, one where every tradition becomes a debate. And now we're back to Prince George, the one person at the center who has absolutely no control over any of it. According to speculation, there were private discussions about what George's life should look like if a storm ever hit. Not in a dramatic, we're removing him way, but in a protective way. How do you raise a future king in a world that might try to tear his identity apart? How do you prepare him without terrifying him? How do you balance truth, duty, and childhood? Those aren't constitutional questions. They're human ones. And they're the kind that don't have perfect answers. Because even if the monarchy survives, George still has to grow up. He still has to read headlines one day. He still has to live in a world where strangers argue about his legitimacy like it's a sport. And that's why, if insiders are right, the adults around him aren't only fighting for an institution. They're fighting for a boy's right to have a future that isn't defined by conspiracy. So the real question isn't, is the rumor true? The real question is, if enough people believe it, does truth even matter anymore? And that's the kind of question that keeps history from staying buried. Because the envelope, if it exists, isn't just paper. It's a symbol of something deeper. A late monarch choosing to contain knowledge rather than unleash it. A family forced to protect a child while carrying a secret too heavy to share. And a modern world that doesn't respect closed doors the way it used to. And the scariest part? If this story ever becomes public, it won't unfold like a slow investigation. It'll unfold like an avalanche. One leak, one headline, one viral clip. Then suddenly everyone has a theory. Everyone has a source, and the truth, whatever it is, gets drowned under the noise. But that still leaves one final mystery that people keep circling back to. If the Queen truly ordered these tests, and if the results truly raised questions, why didn't she destroy them? Because sealing something isn't the same as erasing it. Sealing it means you expect it might matter later. And if that's true, then maybe the late Queen didn't lock away a secret to hide it forever. Maybe she locked it away because she knew one day someone would need to decide what to do with it. And what happens when that day finally comes? Could reshape the monarchy in a way nobody is ready for.